Now, for more on this story, let's bring in the Athletics U.S. men's national team reporter, Paul Tenorio, who has been on top of this story. Now, Paul, just take us through, first of all, this process that eventually led to Gregg Berhalter's ouster as U.S. men's national team coach. What ultimately led U.S. Soccer to make this decision?
It came down to a very simple thing, results. We just got off the phone with Matt Crocker and asked him that exact question. What made things different in your mind that Gregg Berhalter isn't the right voice to lead this program forward? And he said, there's been a lot of progress made with this young group under Gregg Berhalter, but now is the time to turn that progress into results. And he felt like the results obviously were not there during the Copa America. And even despite the other factors like Tim Weah's red card, there were benchmarks that they wanted to hit in the Copa America. That didn't happen. And Matt Crocker felt like it was time to find a new voice that could push this team from, opportunity, from projection into actual on-field results.
Is there a belief from the federation that the player personnel right now is the right group of players to lead this team to success as well? Because those have to come into question too, yes?
Of course. I think that's going to be the task of the next coach, is to look at everything that Gregg Berhalter has done, to evaluate the player pool, to maybe try to foster more competition within the player pool, right? We saw players who weren't playing at the club level that were playing significant minutes at the national team. Is that because it's what's needed? Would it be good to try to create more competition where guys feel like their place is in jeopardy if they're not playing? Does that impact the way that the team worked on the field, that some guys felt like they had a place in this team no matter what? I think that'll be a big part of the task for the next coach. But right now, Matt Crocker is focused on finding candidates for this job. And I thought one of the more interesting things that he said, which is in my story over at The Athletic, is that, he feels like he can be more targeted in this search. We've seen U.S. Soccer, they kind of go through processes, they take their time. The goal is to have a coach in place by the window in September. That means that they're going to have to get moving on this search. And Matt Crocker said, look, I've been here for over a year now. I've been working very closely with both the men's and women's program. I feel very confident about what's needed, the things I see that could help this team move forward. I can be much more targeted and much more aggressive in my search for a coach, and I'm going to do just that. So we could see this search move quite quickly.
Now, Paul, there's been some big names linked to this job, and us as the U.S. soccer media and also American soccer fans have touted the likes of a Jurgen Klopp. But who are some of the names that you're hearing automatically since this news has dropped?
Yeah, no names yet. Matt Crocker didn't go into who the candidates are, at least officially. I think there are some interesting factors. One, he said it's going to be a global search, though I did ask whether or not speaking English is still a priority or a necessity for this job, and he said communication is very important and it remains important for a coach to be able to communicate with the player pool. So we'll see how that impacts the search. One interesting name that I think would be a good fit for the program is England coach Gareth Southgate. Obviously, England advancing to a Euro final. How will that impact Southgate's place with the England team going forward? He's obviously been a controversial coach back home in England, but playing for another title here, playing for another championship, as they did at the Euros just a few years ago. What is that going to mean for him? And, of course, there's a history between Gareth Southgate and Matt Crocker. They worked together on the England DNA, which was essentially creating the identity of the England national teams from the youth all the way through the first team that's led to this resurgence of the national team program under Gareth Southgate. That's one name I'm very intrigued to see whether or not U.S. Soccer approaches. And then, yeah, we get into some of those dream scenarios like Jurgen Klopp, will they go to Pochettino? Will we see them really reaching for big candidates? I would note another interesting fact from Matt Crocker. He said, look, we understand that we have to be competitive with salary. We are committed. We are ready to spend money on this position.
Let's go back when Gregg Berhalter was in that limbo period in between the end of the World Cup and when he was eventually rehired. You look at these last 18 months, they feel like a bit of a waste of time. When you go back to that period, what was U.S. Soccer's thought process, and how serious was it actually considered that maybe Berhalter wouldn't be the one that stayed on, and say someone like Jesse Marsch could have taken the job and we wouldn't be talking about needing to make a change again?
Yeah, of course, hindsight 2020, that's one of the questions. What do you feel you could have done differently, or maybe what have you learned that you look back at that process, Matt Crocker, and say, we did this wrong or we didn't quite see this? He felt like they went through a very thorough process prior. They were looking for a coach who could maximize this player pool. They felt like there had been really good progress within the team. The results leading into the World Cup were decent. I thought the performances at the World Cup were good, and Matt Crocker felt so as well. And they believed that Gregg Berhalter was still going to be the right coach for this job. And I think the reality is, since Gregg Berhalter took back over, the results haven't been there. Not just in the Copa America. They lost a friendly against Germany. They lost a friendly against Colombia in embarrassing fashion, frankly. They lost the game in Trinidad. They needed a late goal against Jamaica. So there hasn't seemed to be forward movement with this group, and that's concerning. Would Jesse Marsch have been a fit? I think clearly he's a coach who has a lot of confidence. He's injected some of that confidence into Canada in this tournament. He was a very strong candidate before. Maybe he'll be a candidate again. But I think really the question Matt Crocker has to ask is, why didn't we think prior that this team needed a new voice? And that's always the debate when you talk about a second cycle coach, that sometimes that voice, that same message just doesn't resonate the second time through. And I think that was the case here with Gregg Berhalter and this national team.
I like that you use the word voice, because the voice of the American public is much louder than it's ever been regarding this sport. They're a lot more educated than they have been a generation ago, or even just a few years ago. And a move like this and a tournament like that would have ruined some of that goodwill with that fan base. So how does the USSF regain some of that through a proactive hire?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's exactly that, right? In reality, this World Cup is so different than any before because they're hosting it, and because this country is more educated about soccer. They're more excited about soccer. You can tune in to so many different networks on every weekend and watch the best teams in the world play, and that's created an energy around the sport that we haven't seen before. And so I think the difficulty for U.S. soccer would had you kept Gregg Berhalter in place going into this tournament, the conversation would have been about Gregg Berhalter. And they don't want that. They want the conversation to be about the team. They want people to be excited to come out and watch games, to go into stadiums, to try to create momentum for the sport. And this coaching hire bears some of that responsibility too. You have to find somebody that at least fans can feel excited about, I think, or that it allows the attention to turn back to the team. Whether that's a Jurgen Klopp, of course, that's a dream scenario. He's a legendary coach. All the people who tune into the Premier League on weekends are going to be so happy with that type of hire that they'll come out and watch partly for the coach. But I think really in general, you just want somebody that's going to inspire people, inspire confidence in the team, and create excitement, because the goal for Copa America was to do that, right? The goal was to create momentum 2 years out from another major tournament that the U.S. was going to host. It didn't do that. So now this coaching hire, I think, has to try to create that momentum again.
How much do you think, on that subject, because you're looking about building enthusiasm, and it seemed like Gregg Berhalter reached a point where he would have been incapable of doing that. Do you think that factored in at all to the decision-making from U.S. soccer here, that part of building across this 2026 World Cup, not even just for U.S. soccer, but for all of the stakeholders in soccer, MLS, the NWSL, all of these leagues that are hoping to profit off of a major surge in enthusiasm in this sport? Do you feel like in some ways this change might have been slightly motivated by that desire to get the fan base excited again?
Of course, you'd like to evaluate things and say, okay, let's put everything into a vacuum. Who's the best coach just for the sporting side of things? The reality is, we're not operating in a vacuum. Those voices from the fans are going to be heard. You want the fan base to be a part of this movement. That's just the reality. I have to think that the program, the national team, the federation understood that they had to do something to shake things up, to get fans back on board, of course. Because like I said before, this 2026 World Cup is not just about on-field results. You want to take this generation of players who have moved over to Europe at younger ages, some of whom are playing at bigger clubs, and you want to use that as a step forward. And that's about results on the field. Of course, the ideal will be that this U.S. team makes a run through the World Cup, but it's about building excitement around the sport. You don't want to be fighting against yourself going into the tournament, right? You need everything moving together. I believe that had to have factored into this. It's not just about a sporting decision when we're talking about the national team head coach, typically in general, but certainly going into this World Cup in 2 years' time.
Now, in previous searches for a manager, especially in previous cycles, we've heard that the ability to speak English has been a big factor in deciding whether a manager is hired or not. If something like that was to come up, how would that impact some of the managers shortlisted? Maybe the bookies have some insight into it, but some of the managers shortlisted and really intrigued in a job like this.
Yeah, well, as I said, Matt Crocker said it's important for the coach to be able to communicate with the player pool. So certainly I think it still factors into some degree. There are a lot of coaching candidates out there who do speak English fluently. I think there are coaches out there who speak English as a second language and have found ways to communicate with players in that second language. I don't know to what degree you have to evaluate the ability to use the language other than can you communicate with the team. And I think to a certain degree, I'm sure they're factoring in the ability to communicate to the public. Again, this is a public-facing role. You're going to be the face of the national team program. But, in our conversation with Matt Crocker, the interview that we did with Matt Crocker earlier tonight, he said, it is important for the coach to be able to communicate with the player pool. That was the specific requirement. It wasn't you must speak English, but you must be able to communicate with the player pool. I think there are some intriguing candidates who don't speak English as a first language. Patrick Vieira, for example, I think would be a great coach. But we've seen Patrick come over. He speaks fluent English, played in England for a long time, obviously, coached NYCFC. So it's not as though, you're looking at just American candidates or something like that. I think the end game is to find somebody who can move this program forward, can also be a face of the program, and certainly is able to inspire something more out of this group.
Now, I'm not certain a lot of people want to hear this at this moment in time. I think this news probably is greeted positively by most U.S. men's national team fans, but this era wasn't all bad. From Gregg Berhalter's vantage point, you think about the dominance over Mexico. There were definitely moments of positivity. After failing to qualify for the World Cup, they did qualify for the World Cup. From your standpoint, what next for Gregg Berhalter? Because I do think that he does leave this job with a little bit of credit, but is he going into another national team job? Is he going back into managing an MLS? Might he even be viewed favorably enough to go manage in Europe? What do you think is next for him?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I would say that the most likely scenario is that he ends up coaching in an MLS again. I mean, the first thing I thought of was Atlanta United. That's a big job that's open. I could see Gregg Berhalter stepping into that job where Arthur Blank spends money and being successful right away in Major League Soccer in a market that's really, really important for the league. Certainly, he has an interest in coaching overseas. We saw that through this last coaching search. He spoke to Club America. We know he spent time overseas meeting with different coaches and trying to, I think, create connections over there. It's an interesting dynamic, though. It's still very, very difficult for American coaches to break in Europe. Jesse Marsch went through the Red Bull pipeline to get into Europe. We can go further back to that, to Bob Bradley. It's not easy to break in England or in Europe. And I think, ultimately they judge you based on the national team results that they know and care about, which are things like the World Cup and, unfortunately for Gregg Berhalter, the Copa America. So, could he get an opportunity somewhere like in Holland where he played, maybe in England? Obviously, he also played there with Crystal Palace. I could see a championship level team or a Dutch team taking a chance on him. But for me, I would say the more likely scenario is that he's coaching in Major League Soccer.